Chapter 1. And so it came to pass that Jesus spoke to the 12, saying, I will reveal to you the mystery of mysteries, which it is my ministry to disclose. The good news that leads to eternal life. The truth that will set you free. Be not afraid when I tell you that I am not who you think I am. I am not a man of flesh and blood. In fact, I don't really exist at all. I am the fictional hero of an allegorical myth. A great silence fell upon the disciples, and Jesus added, I know it's a bit of a shock. Then Peter spoke in amazement, saying, Lord, I understand not the wisdom of your words. And Jesus replied, Listen up, and I will reveal the astonishing truth. What I am exists far beyond this world we inhabit. Jesus is a character in a story, and I am the author speaking through Jesus. I am the creator of the story, so I am everything in the story. I am this rock and that piece of wood. Whatever you do to anyone, you do to me. Look inside yourself, and I am there. Do you get it now? You're saying you're God, announced Peter. I like the sound of that. It's a bit blasphemous, but extremely impressive. And as one of your close disciples, it makes me look good. That's just theological twaddle. I'm trying to tell you something obvious about our predicament right now, declared Jesus. You and I are characters in a story being imagined by the author. We don't really exist. Look, Lord, we'll never set up the biggest religious cult in history with this no one really exists nonsense, advised Peter. Leave the philosophy to Socrates. Think of your market. Stick with the simple parables and homey homilies, the Good Samaritan, that sort of thing. But we're in a parable right now, for heaven's sake, replied Jesus, beginning to find Peter irritating as always. This is a fable, and we're symbolic figures in it. Understand and be astonished. I'm astonished, all right. I've been going along with your crazy ideas for a year now, but to be honest, I've had enough. 1 minute you're God, then you're just a man, and then you don't exist at all. Next, you're going to tell me that your water into wine stunt was a cheap conjuring trick done with mirrors. Speculating about how I pulled off my miracles is a complete waste of time, because I don't really do any miracles. I'm not sure about this new direction, Jesus, complained Peter. I like my heroes to be historical. I like my miracles to be genuine supernatural anomalies. It's not a new direction, it's just the truth, insisted Jesus. I've always referred to myself as the Son of Man, which is a Semitic idiom meaning simply a man, any man. It's a literary device to show that I'm an everyman figure in a symbolic myth. Well, you're a lot more than that to me, Lord. As far as I'm concerned, you walk on water, literally. It's a metaphor, for Christ's sake, said Jesus, unable to contain his exasperation. Peter felt the anger of the Lord and fell into penitential silence. Finally, he said sheepishly, I have no idea what you're talking about, Jesus. Sorry. Of course you don't, dear Peter, said Jesus, adopting a shepherdly tone. You represent the foolish person in this story, which is why I gave you the name Peter, meaning clod. You play the part of a clod who doesn't really get it, whilst I play the lucid mouthpiece for the wisdom of the author. That doesn't sound very fair, muttered Peter, a bit put out. Fair or unfair is irrelevant. We don't exist. We're made-up characters in a story. Well, what about Mary? Asked Peter. I suppose she's real enough. You'll look pretty sad if it turns out that you've been sleeping with an imaginary woman. Whoa, Peter, cautioned Jesus. You know there's nothing about any of that in the Jesus story, at least not in the official version. Then Mary Magdalene spoke, saying, Yes, Lord, please do tell. I suppose that I don't really exist either? And as a woman, I find that disappointingly patriarchal. And Jesus answered, You're also a character in this great story. You play the part of the foolish soul who is lost in the world, searching for love in all the wrong places. But you're redeemed by the Christ and become the wise soul who listens and understands. I didn't understand a word of that, declared Mary, because she was usually pretty honest, although she did occasionally tell a few white lies about her past. You don't understand yet, Jesus reassured her. "But you will by the end of this gospel." "I'm sure you're right. You're always right," conceded Mary, because she was on a bit of a guru trip with Jesus and wrongly assumed that he was infallible about everything. "It's only because I am the voice of the author who has the prerogative of deciding what will turn out to be right," confessed Jesus. "So let me get this straight," said Mary. "You're saying that this is just a story?" "Bingo!" exclaimed Jesus. "But doesn't that make all of our adventures together completely meaningless?" asked Mary. "It all felt so important when I believed it was real. Now it seems like a bit of a damp squib." "The opposite is the truth," replied Jesus. "Understanding that the Jesus story is a myth reveals its true significance. You see, the Jesus story is an allegory for the spiritual journey each person must make if they are to awaken to the mystical state that the original Christians called gnosis, which means knowledge." Then he added, "And what's more, I am going to decode the allegorical meaning of the Jesus story and reveal the secret teachings of gnosis later in this gospel. Only this time, I'll mix the heavy stuff up with some witty banter to make it more entertaining for the masses." "Wow, secret teachings," enthused Mary. "Sounds fantastic." "Sounds like flippant nonsense," complained Peter. "This gospel will be flippant, but not just flippant," explained Jesus. "Satire also has a serious side, which is what makes it the highest form of wit. After all, the real literary stars of the ancient world are satirists, such as Menippus and Lucian. Their hilarious rants about wandering miracle workers making a fortune out of the gullible are a hoot. So I've decided to do this new gospel in the same genre." "Exactly how much Eucharist have you been drinking?" interrupted Peter. "I'm sorry," replied Jesus. "I must try to watch my tendency to indulge in obscure digressions. After all, I screwed up last time by being too cryptic." "Last time?" queried Peter. "There I go again," said Jesus cryptically. Peter looked as confused as Catholic theology, so the Lord comforted him, saying, "It's of no importance that you understand, Peter. I'm not speaking for your benefit, but for the listener who is hearing these words. It is the listener I desire to set free, and to whom I will reveal the secrets of gnosis." "Who the hell is that?" asked Peter. "A good question," said Jesus, "and one I hope the listener will ask themselves, because that question leads to gnosis. This gospel is going to demand that the listener engage deeply with the ideas I am going to explore. They'll need an open mind, because I'm going to suggest that they are also a character in a story." "You've gone completely bonkers," concluded Peter. "It's no good arguing with me. I don't really exist." "Do you know your problem, Jesus? You're obsessed with your own non-existence. Just let yourself be for a moment." Then Peter put his arm around Jesus in a blokey sort of way and suggested, "Curse a couple of fig trees like you used to do in the old days. You'll feel like yourself again in no time." And so it came to pass that the Lord pulled himself up straight, because normally he had a bit of a hunch like the Dalai Lama, and bellowed, "You're as brainless as a rock. If I'm not careful, you'll go off and found some authoritarian church based on a complete misunderstanding of my teachings, which will inhibit humanity's spiritual evolution for nearly 2 millennia. That's why I agreed to do this gospel of the second coming and clear things up once and for all." Chapter 2. The conversation really wasn't going as well as Jesus had hoped. He was starting to regret ever letting himself be talked into a comeback. He'd been perfectly content hanging out in eternity and wasn't interested in a sequel. After all, what could match the success of his last appearance? But that was all before he read that damn book. Freke and Gandy had sent him a copy of their latest publication, The Laughing Jesus, probably hoping for a review. Eternity is a long time, and there's nothing much to do. So the Lord actually read it, and boy, he learned a thing or two. He had been very taken with the title, The Laughing Jesus, which made him feel that it was time to lighten up. So he had gone straight out and borrowed Freke and Gandy's other books from the Akashic Library, put his feet up, and, with a cup of cocoa, indulged his rather narcissistic hobby of reading books about himself. In the Jesus Mysteries, Freke and Gandy claimed that Jesus is a mythical figure, not a historical man. Explosive stuff. Then they followed this up with Jesus and the Lost Goddess, in which they showed that Christianity originally involved a goddess. Bombshell! And they topped that off in The Laughing Jesus, with a blistering assault on the pernicious power of organized religion. Kerpow! What impressed the Lord most about these rather controversial books was the meticulous research and the way everything was backed up with copious footnotes. It just made him assume the authors must know what they were talking about. Freke and Gandy's theories didn't come as a complete surprise to the Lord, who had realized that he didn't really exist as soon as he had died and resurrected. But in these books he found the proof, both historical and philosophical, to back up his intuition. It was a revelation. In fact, the Lord couldn't help hoping that Freke and Gandy were working on a fourth installment of their Jesus trilogy, and that's what made him spontaneously decide to contact them. It was an unthought-out, spur-of-the-moment type thing, typical of people who live in the eternal now. He just wanted to tell them, from personal experience, that they'd sell a ton more books if they put their ideas across in a work of fiction. Freke and Gandy had been hoping to hear from Jesus because he was central to their latest half-baked scheme to change the world. They suggested getting together for a chat. Jesus was keen on brainstorming creative ideas, but Freke and Gandy clearly had their own agenda right from the start. They were adamant that the way forward was to write a new, more entertaining version of the Jesus story, and they wanted the Lord to reprise his starring role. They had even come up with a catchy title, The Gospel of the Second Coming. To be honest, they originally wanted to write Jesus out of the story altogether, because he caused so many problems. But that wasn't so easy, since the original Jesus story had been like a pilot for a soap opera that now had people really hooked. So they came to the conclusion that the only thing to do was to make up a new story about Jesus, in which he repeated all the nice things he said before about love and forgiveness, but without any of the nasty bits about eternal damnation and gnashing of teeth. Then, perhaps, it would be easier to write Jesus out altogether. At first, the Lord wasn't taken with the idea, because he felt that Freke and Gandy were trying to bandwagon on his celebrity. For their part, they reminded him that he had promised to make a final appearance at the end of time, so maybe he could combine the two. They went on to point out how successful the Da Vinci Code had been, showing that the public was ready for a new take on Christianity, on top of which they were confident that they could cajole some professor to write an introduction to the book, so the project would have academic respectability. And if no one would put their career on the line like that, they'd just make someone up, no problem. When that didn't cut it with the Lord, Freke and Gandy started to whine about having droned on for years about Jesus not really existing, but with very limited success. Perhaps, if Jesus told them himself, people would finally listen. After all, he still had a modicum of authority, except among thinking people, and they weren't the problem. Freke and Gandy were keen that this time there would be a lot more gags, which had to be a good thing. But the Lord was concerned about pushing the blasphemy boat, because it was pointless to deliberately alienate people. But the authors maintained that people without a sense of humor just weren't worth talking to anyway. The Lord couldn't argue with that. What really swung it with the Lord was when Freke and Gandy started to guilt-trip him on how things had gone horribly wrong with Christianity. They went into the gory details about how religiously inspired conflicts were inexorably leading to Armageddon. And they told him about a bunch of fundamentalist Muslims who he didn't like the sound of one bit. And they mentioned something about how cool it would be if we could just get over this religion thing. The Lord didn't say yes there and then. He just said he'd think about it. But as soon as he got home, he looked into all of the trouble spots of the world and found that Freke and Gandy were right. Religion was causing discord all over the place, and in many cases, he was horrified to discover that he was the problem. So the Lord gave them a call to let them know he was up for it, because he realized that this was his opportunity to save the world for real. Anyway, he quite fancied getting back into the limelight. Then he dropped into the conversation that he was working up a few new parables already. But Jesus ditched his own ideas as soon as he looked at Freke and Gandy's script. It was just so good that his stuff paled in comparison. It was theological dynamite. He liked the way it spoke to the ironic sensibilities of the postmodern world. It was multidimensional and offered him a part that he could really sink his teeth into. It gave him a reason to get back in there and transform the Jesus story. Jesus could see that a co-production with Freke and Gandy was a win-win situation. He wanted to help spread their ideas to a wider audience, and they wanted a commercial success so they could finally make some money. It was a marriage made in heaven. It was during rehearsals that artistic differences began to surface. The Lord argued that seeing as he'd made the mess in the first place, it was his job to clear things up in the new version of the Jesus story. But Freke and Gandy were of the opinion that this time people had to do it for themselves. The Lord was reluctant to go along with this because he could be a bit of a prima donna sometimes. But after much explanation, he really got into the idea that the only way was to save the world soul by soul. Once they got him on track, Freke and Gandy persuaded Jesus that the best way to do this was to go back into his story and actually give the teachings of Gnosis for real, not just promise to explain everything later like he did last time. Freke and Gandy had this hypothesis that in Christian mythology, Mary represented the soul of the reader. So they suggested that it would be symbolically satisfying if, over the course of their new gospel, Jesus transformed Mary by telling her everything he'd been told by them. It was a bold plan, but worth a go. If they could seduce people into identifying with the transformation of Mary, they would be transformed by proxy, and then they'd be ready to save the world. Hooray! The Lord wasn't sure about sharing top billing with anyone, but Freke and Gandy went on about how sexy Mary Magdalene was right now, especially with women, and they bought far more of these sorts of books than men. Plus, the goddess thing was big again, and Mary was associated with all that in the popular mind. Jesus had a soft spot for Mary. She was a nice girl, big heart, great legs. According to the Gospel of Philip, the Lord loved Mary more than the other disciples, and he kissed her often on her... Anyway, that's personal stuff that mustn't get into the tabloids. The scandal might jeopardize the second coming. Suffice it to say, the Lord agreed that saving Mary was his best bet. After all, there wasn't much chance of getting through to Peter, and the rest of the 12 were just extras. He was ashamed to admit that he couldn't remember most of their names because they changed so alarmingly from gospel to gospel. So that was that. It was decided that transforming Mary would be the underlying narrative structure of the new-look Jesus story. And secretly, the Lord hoped that, if he could reach Mary, perhaps she would be able to reach Peter, since they'd known each other for years. If only he could stop them from arguing all the time. The Lord felt confident that Mary would be open to the Gnosis. She would like the idea that she was a character in a story, because she had always wanted to be an actress. Surely he was offering her a role that any woman would die for, the tart with a heart who saves humanity. And he knew that, deep down, Mary really wanted to save the world, whereas Peter just wanted to save for his holidays. But the Lord was nervous about strutting his stuff again. Had he lost his touch? Could he really tell Mary all that he learned since he died and resurrected? How would he reveal to her that she existed in a story being imagined by the author? He really wanted Mary to experience Gnosis for herself. Then she'd realize how much better everything gets once you know that you don't really exist. That was his priority. But Mary had a follower of the living master thing going that made it practically impossible. So he decided that before he could go into the deep stuff, he'd have to get Mary to stop taking him literally. Freke and Gandy suggested that the best way to start was by examining the evidence that proved Jesus wasn't a historical person. Once that was out of the way, the Lord could go on to make the secrets of Gnosis really accessible by explaining all the spiritual jargon he used last time. Then he'd be in a position to explain the true allegorical meaning of the Jesus myth, which would really blow everyone's mind. Jesus said he liked all that, but he was very excited by his own idea. As the climax of the whole gospel, he could give Mary a vision of the end of time, because it's one of those things you just can't imagine until you experience it for yourself. Plus, he'd have kept his promise about coming back for the last judgment, which would be a real weight off his mind. Freke and Gandy warned Jesus not to lose the plot. It was no good coming straight in trying to tell everyone that they were just characters in a story. They'd been there, done that. But of course, the Lord couldn't resist giving it a go. although he regretted being so pig-headed now. After the mess he'd made of Chapter 1, he was beginning to wonder why he'd ever let himself be co-opted into such a harebrained project. Anyway, I'm just the narrator, and I've been going on for too long. I just wanted to fill you in on some of the background, because you'll need all the orientation you can get. I don't want to say too much, because it will preempt the story, but I can promise you one hell of a roller coaster ride through history, philosophy, and mythology, spiced with a healthy smattering of parody. We join the Lord again as he is thinking about Freke and Gandy, and what a downer it was that he'd ever met those guys.